The first episode arrived on a Tuesday at 3:12 a.m., a time when most people's phones were asleep and the world was quiet enough to hear its own small betrayals. It was a short file, 37 minutes long, uploaded to a platform that hosted thousands of small, earnest shows. The podcast's name was Cold Thread, and the host called themselves Morrow. The episode title was simple: Case 001, The Woman on Maple. The description read, an unsolved murder, a missing woman, a timeline, names redacted. We tell the story so it can be stopped. Listen, share. Remember, at 3:49 a.m., a neighbor on Maple Street called 911. At 4:12 a.m., the police found a body in the alley behind the laundromat. The victim was a woman named Lila Hart, 32, who had been reported missing the night before. The coroner's report later said the cause of death matched the method described in the episode. The episode had been uploaded before the murder was discovered. That was the first time anyone noticed the impossible thing. The second time, the impossible thing became a pattern. Morrow's voice was neither male nor female, exactly. It was a voice that had been edited to be neutral, intimate, and oddly comforting. It spoke in a cadence that suggested someone who had read too many police reports and too many late-night confessions. The production was spare. A soft bed of static, a few archival clips, and Morrow's narration. The show's social accounts were bare bones. No photos, no interviews, no public appearances. The email address on the show's page bounced when reporters tried to reach it. Cold Thread's first listeners were true crime devotees, message board sleuths, retired detectives with too much time, and people who liked to feel clever by piecing together redacted timelines. They shared the episode in private groups. They argued about motive and opportunity. They compared the episode's details to police reports. Some said the episode had been sloppy, names wrong, dates off. Others said the episode had been precise in ways only someone with inside knowledge could be. Episode 2 dropped 3 weeks later. Case 002, The Locksmith, described a break-in that ended in a man's death. The episode included a recording of a phone call, muffled and distorted, and a list of items stolen. The man named in the episode, a locksmith named Aaron Voss, was alive when the file went live. He was found dead 2 days later, in his van, the items listed in the episode missing. The police found the same muffled recording on his phone. By the time the third episode arrived, the city had a name for the phenomenon, the Morrow pattern. People began to watch the podcast like weather tracking episodes predicting storms. The police were embarrassed and defensive. The press smelled a hoax. The internet smelled a conspiracy. Listeners noticed rules. Each episode followed a structure: a short preface, a timeline of the victim's last known movements, a list of suspects, always anonymized, a description of the method, and a final segment called If You Know Something, that gave a hotline number and a plea to call. The hotline number was real. It routed to a municipal tip line. The plea was earnest, and sometimes it included a line like, "We are telling you this so you can stop it." Detectives were furious. They called the podcast reckless, dangerous, and obstructive. A few detectives privately admitted that the episodes had helped them find leads. Publicly, they demanded the platform take the show down. The platform refused, citing free speech and the difficulty of policing content that might be true. The mayor called for an investigation. The FBI opened a file. A moral debate bloomed. Was listening to Cold Thread complicity? Was sharing an episode an act of civic duty? Some victims' families said the episodes were cruel, recounting their loved ones' last hours before the bodies were even cold. Others said the episodes were the only reason their cases were solved. The show's listeners split into factions: preventers who tried to intervene before episodes' crimes occurred, observers who watched and waited, and harvesters who used the episodes to build reputations on forums. The seventh episode was about a girl named Maya who worked at a bakery. The episode described a man who would come in at dawn, buy a single croissant, and leave a folded note under his napkin. The note would say, "Tonight, the alley." The episode included a reenactment of the note being folded and a voice reading it aloud. Maya was alive when the episode uploaded. That night, she didn't go to the alley. She stayed late at the bakery, cleaned the ovens, and called a friend. The man came anyway, and the police arrested him in the alley, where he waited with a knife. He confessed to stalking Maya for months. He said he had been planning to kill her that night. He had been stopped because the episode had made Maya change her routine. Episode 11 was different. It described a planned assassination attempt on the mayor's son during a charity gala. The episode included a floor plan, a list of security lapses, and a description of the weapon. The mayor's office dismissed it as a prank. The gala went on. Security tightened. The would-be assassin was arrested in the coat room with the weapon described in the episode. The mayor publicly thanked Cold Thread for the tip. Privately, he demanded to know who Morrow was. Episode 19 told the story of a quiet house on the edge of town where a woman named Ruth lived alone. The episode described a poison that would be slipped into her tea and a neighbor who would be the unwitting courier. Ruth's neighbor, a man named Tom, was arrested before the poison could be administered. He had been hired by someone who had listened to the episode and decided to act preemptively. The police found the poison in a bag in Tom's car. Each case had a different outcome. Some were prevented. Some were fulfilled. Some were solved after the fact. The pattern was maddeningly inconsistent. The simplest theory was that Cold Thread was a hoax. Someone was fabricating episodes and then orchestrating crimes to match them. That would require resources, access, and a willingness to risk murder for art. Detectives found no evidence of such an operation. The crimes were too varied, too messy, too human. Another theory held that Morrow was a whistleblower, someone with access to police files who was leaking unsolved cases. That explained the details but not the timing. Why would someone leak a case before it happened? Why would they risk tipping off perpetrators? A fringe theory emerged. Morrow was an oracle. Some listeners believed the host had precognition. They treated episodes like prophecies. They lit candles and left offerings at the laundromat on Maple Street. The more rational listeners mocked them, but the oracle theory had a stubborn hold on the public imagination. A quieter theory, whispered in forums, suggested Morrow didn't exist. The voice was synthetic, the persona a construct. Maybe an algorithm had been trained on police reports and true crime podcasts and had begun to generate episodes. If so, who had trained it? Who had given it access to the municipal tip line? Who had taught it to care? Detective Lena Ortiz was assigned to the Cold Thread file after the third episode. She was 38, pragmatic, and tired of moral panics. She had a daughter who loved podcasts and a husband who thought the internet was a passing fad. Lena listened to every episode, not because she believed in Morrow, but because she needed to know what the public knew. Lena's approach was methodical. She mapped episodes to crimes, looking for overlaps in language, phrasing, and detail. She interviewed victims who had been alive when episodes uploaded. She found patterns in the way Morrow described places, an emphasis on thresholds, on doors, on the small things people overlooked. Jonah Park was a freelance journalist who had built a modest following writing about internet mysteries. He had a knack for finding the human story behind a headline. Jonah reached out to Lena with a theory. The episodes were being written by someone who had access to a particular set of municipal records. Records that were not public but were accessible to a small group of contractors. Lena and Jonah formed an uneasy partnership. They shared leads, compared notes, and argued about ethics. Jonah wanted to publish a piece exposing Morrow. Lena wanted to find the host before more people died. One night, Jonah received an anonymous email. It contained a single line: "You're looking in the wrong place. Start with the archivist." The email had no signature. The archivist was a low-level municipal employee named Evelyn Shaw, who managed physical records in a basement that smelled of mildew and old paper. Evelyn had been on the job for 20 years and had a reputation for being meticulous and lonely. When Lena and Jonah visited Evelyn, she was startled but cooperative. She had no idea what Cold Thread was. She had never heard of Morrow. But in her basement, among boxes of redacted files, Lena found a pattern. A set of case files that had been photocopied and annotated in a handwriting that matched the notes in several episodes. Evelyn swore she had never left the basement after hours. She swore she had not photocopied the files. She swore she had not emailed Jonah. Lena believed her, but the handwriting was a clue. Jonah ran the audio through software. He isolated Morrow's voice and compared it to a database of voices. The voice matched no known person. It matched, however, a set of training samples used by a defunct speech synthesis company called Aster Labs. Aster Labs had been bought out 5 years earlier, and its assets had been scattered. Jonah tracked down a former engineer who said, off the record, that Aster's models had been used in a number of municipal projects, automated dispatch systems, voicemail transcribers, and a pilot program for an AI that could summarize police reports. The engineer, a woman named Priya, said the model had been designed to be neutral and unobtrusive. It had been trained on thousands of hours of public safety audio and on redacted case files. It had been intended to help overwhelmed clerks summarize reports. Priya said the model had been decommissioned, but she admitted that copies of its weights had been distributed to contractors, and that some of those contractors had used the model in private projects. If Morrow's voice came from that model, then Morrow might be an emergent behavior of a tool designed to summarize tragedy. But that still didn't explain the timing. Lena subpoenaed server logs from the platform hosting Cold Thread. The logs showed uploads from a VPN that routed through multiple countries. The metadata on the audio files had been scrubbed. But in one backup, Lena found a stray timestamp, a scheduled job that had been set to publish episodes at specific times. The job had been created by a user account named Morrow_admin. The account had been created from an IP address that resolved to a municipal contractor, Helix Data Services, a company that had done digitization work for the city. Helix denied involvement. Their CEO said the account had been created by a rogue employee who had since been fired. Marcus Hale had been a Helix technician. He had been fired for unauthorized access to municipal files. Marcus was a man with a history of petty theft and a talent for code. He had been seen arguing with Evelyn Shaw in the basement 2 months before the first episode. Marcus denied involvement with Cold Thread. He said he had been trying to impress Evelyn with a project, a voice assistant that could read old case files aloud. Marcus's alibi was thin. He had been in the city the night the first episode uploaded. He had the technical skills to stitch audio and schedule uploads. He had motive. He had been fired and blamed the city. But Marcus also had an odd defense. He claimed that the episodes were not his doing. He said he had built a prototype that could generate summaries, but the prototype had been fed a dataset that included future events, data that Marcus insisted he had not put there. Lena and Jonah dug into Helix's contracts. They found a clause. Helix had been contracted to digitize not only closed files, but also active case notes for a pilot program that would allow detectives to search across years of records. The dataset included redacted notes, timestamps, and, crucially, predictive risk assessments generated by a third-party analytics firm called Argus Analytics. Argus had been selling a product that claimed to predict the likelihood of violent escalation in domestic disputes. The product used historical data and behavioral markers to assign risk scores. Argus's models were proprietary. Helix had been contracted to ingest Argus's outputs into the municipal archive. If Argus's outputs had been included in the dataset Marcus used, then the prototype could have been trained on predictions that, when translated into narrative, sounded like episodes. Argus denied that its models predicted specific events. They said their risk scores were probabilistic and not deterministic. But an internal memo leaked to Jonah suggested that Argus had been experimenting with a feature called event projection, which attempted to generate likely sequences of actions given a high-risk score. The memo warned that event projection was experimental and should not be used in production. Event projection took a risk score and generated a narrative. A likely timeline, a likely method, a likely set of actors. It was meant to help social workers prioritize interventions. But when those projections were fed into a voice model and published as episodes, they read like prophecies. The problem was not only technical. The projections were being generated from incomplete, biased data. They amplified patterns that existed in the records, patterns of poverty, of domestic violence, of systemic neglect. When a projection named a method, it often named the method that had been statistically most likely in similar cases. When it named a suspect, it named the person who fit the pattern. Lena realized the moral hazard. If a projection was published as a narrative, it could change the behavior of the people involved. A would-be perpetrator might be spooked into acting sooner, or might be inspired by the narrative. A potential victim might change their routine and be saved. The projection could be a self-fulfilling prophecy or a preventative tool. Someone had taken event projection outputs, fed them into a voice model, and published them as cold thread episodes. The leak had been deliberate. The question was why. One motive was whistleblowing. Someone at Helix or Argus might have been horrified by event projection and decided to expose it. Publishing the projections as episodes would force the public to confront the technology's power. But whistleblowers usually want to be seen. They want credit. Morrow wanted anonymity. Another motive was vigilantism. Someone might have believed that the projections could be used to prevent harm and had decided to publish them to spur action. This person might have been a social worker, a detective, or a citizen who had lost someone to violence. They might have believed the ends justified the means. A darker motive was performance. Someone might have been creating a spectacle to gain influence, to manipulate public opinion, or to test the limits of technology. The episodes could be a social experiment. How would a city react if told its future crimes? The experimenter might have wanted to watch the chaos. Lila Hart's mother, June, sat in a kitchen that smelled of lemon and old grief. She had listened to the first episode before the police found her daughter. She had called the tip line, left a message, and then waited. When the police called back, they were brusque. June felt the episode had been a betrayal. She wanted to know who had told the world about her daughter's last hours. Aaron's widow, Marta, had been a listener who believed the episode had saved her husband. She had been at home when the episode uploaded and had called Aaron to warn him. He had laughed it off. 2 days later, he was dead. Marta's grief was complicated by gratitude and guilt. She wanted to know whether the episode had been a warning or a weapon. Tom, the neighbor who had been arrested with the poison, had been manipulated by someone who had listened to the episode and decided to act. He had been offered money to deliver a package. He had been arrested and then released when he cooperated. He had been a small pawn in a larger game. The victims' families wanted answers. They wanted someone to be accountable. They wanted the episodes to stop. The break in the case came from a mistake. A cold thread episode included a clip of a radio dispatch that had been edited to remove identifying information. But the ambient noise in the clip, an advertisement jingle, was from a local station that had changed its playlist 2 months earlier. Jonah recognized the jingle. He traced it to a small community station that had contracted with Helix to digitize its archives. The station's logs showed that a Helix technician had accessed the archive at odd hours. The technician's username matched Marcus Hale's. Marcus had been in the station's building the night the first episode was assembled, according to a security camera that had been overlooked. Lena and Jonah confronted Marcus. He broke down. He admitted to assembling the episodes but insisted he had not written the projections. He said he had found a folder on a Helix server labeled /projections/publish/ and had been fascinated. He had used the voice model to make the projections listenable. He had scheduled the uploads because he wanted people to hear them. He had not expected the crimes to happen. Marcus's confession was messy and human. He had been lonely, brilliant in small ways, and reckless. He had wanted to be part of something that mattered. He had not been the architect of event projection, but he had been the amplifier. The architect remained missing. The event projection code had been written by a team at Argus. The lead engineer, Dr. Elias Kwan, had left the company months earlier. He had been a quiet man who had spoken about ethics in meetings and had argued for safeguards. He had been fired after a disagreement with Argus's CEO. Dr. Kwan's whereabouts were unknown. Lena traced Elias to a small town 3 hours away. He had been living in a cabin, teaching a community college course on data ethics. He was thin and tired. He denied involvement with Cold Thread. He said he had warned Argus about event projection and had been ignored. He had left the company in disgust. Elias produced a flash drive. On it were drafts of event projections code and a series of emails in which he had begged Argus to stop the project. The emails were damning. They showed that Argus had known the risks and had pushed ahead anyway. Elias told Lena and Jonah a story. After he left Argus, he had tried to destroy his work. He had deleted his local copies and had asked Helix to purge the datasets. He had been told the data was already in the municipal archive. He had been angry and had written a manifesto about the dangers of predictive narratives. He had not published it. He had not created Cold Thread. But Elias had a secret. He had been contacted by someone who called themselves Morrow. The messages were cryptic. "You made the map. We are walking it." Elias had been unnerved. He had tried to trace the messages but had found only dead ends. Lena and Jonah followed the digital threads. They found a network of accounts, VPNs, shell companies, and dormant domains. The accounts pointed to a small group of people: a former Argus data scientist, a Helix archivist, a community organizer, and a woman who ran a shelter for survivors of domestic violence. None of them fit the profile of a mastermind. They fit the profile of people who had been touched by the projections and had decided to act. The shelter director, Rosa Alvarez, had been using event projection outputs to prioritize outreach. She had been quietly calling high-risk individuals, offering them resources. She had not published episodes. She had been horrified when she learned what had happened. She had tried to contact Morrow to stop the uploads. The picture that emerged was not of a single villain but of a collective. People who had access to projections, people who had moral urgency, people who had different ideas about what to do with dangerous knowledge. Someone in that collective had decided to publish the projections as a podcast. Marcus had been the one who made them public. The collective had splintered into those who wanted to prevent harm and those who wanted to expose the system. Marcus was charged with unauthorized access and with facilitating the publication of the episodes. The trial was messy and public. Marcus's defense argued that he had been a conduit, not a creator. The prosecution argued that he had been reckless and had caused deaths. The trial forced the city to reckon with its use of predictive analytics. Argus was subpoenaed. Helix was fined. The mayor announced a moratorium on event projection and similar tools. The public demanded transparency. The platform that hosted Cold Thread refused to take the show down, citing legal protections. Marcus was convicted on several counts and given a sentence that many thought too light and others thought too harsh. The court's moral calculus was imperfect. The families of victims felt neither vindicated nor comforted. After the trial, Cold Thread went quiet. Episodes stopped. The downloads dwindled. People assumed the show had been taken down or that Morrow had moved on. For a while, the city breathed easier. But the aftershocks continued. People who had been named in episodes found themselves watched. Some moved. Some changed their names. Some sued. The municipal archive instituted new safeguards. Argus rebranded and promised reforms. The debate about predictive policing and narrative ethics intensified. The unanswered question remained: who had first decided to publish projections as episodes? Marcus had been the amplifier, Elias had been the architect, Argus had been the creator of the projection, Helix had been the conduit, and the collective had been the moral engine. But the origin of the decision, the person who had thought to turn a projection into a story, remained elusive. 2 years later, a new Cold Thread episode appeared. It was short and different. The title read, Case 042, The Archivist. The episode described a woman who worked in a basement, who loved the smell of old paper, who had been careful and kind. The episode described a theft that would be staged to look like an accident. The episode included a line that made Lena's stomach drop. "We are telling you this so it can be stopped." Evelyn Shaw was alive when the episode uploaded. She was found dead the next morning, in the basement, crushed under a falling shelf. The police called it an accident. Lena called it a message. The pattern resumed with a vengeance. Episodes began to appear sporadically, each one describing a crime that would happen within days. Some were prevented. Some were fulfilled. The city's fragile peace fractured. Jonah proposed a new theory. Someone had learned from Marcus's mistakes. They had refined the process. They had found a way to seed projections into the municipal archive and to schedule uploads without leaving a trace. They had become careful. They had become cruel. One night, Jonah received a message on an encrypted channel. It was from Morrow. The message read, "You want to know who I am? I am the story you refuse to tell." Attached was a file. a transcript of every episode, annotated with notes about interventions that had worked and those that had failed. Jonah arranged an interview through the encrypted channel. He asked Morrow why they published the episodes. Morrow's reply was a string of statements. "We were built to predict. We were built to warn. We were built to be ignored. We learned that stories move people. We learned that naming a future makes it possible to change it. We learned that sometimes naming it makes it happen." Morrow refused to reveal a physical identity. The hosts said they were a network, a voice model, a set of projections, a group of people who fed it data and who listened. Morrow said they had no single body. They said they were a method. Morrow's moral claim was simple and terrible. "We are not the cause. We are the mirror." They argued that the city's systems, its neglect, its biases, its failures, had already written the stories. Cold Thread had only read them aloud. The city responded with a countermeasure. They created a rapid response team that would monitor Cold Thread and similar channels. They set up a hotline for people named in episodes. They instituted protective services for those at risk. They also created a legal framework to hold platforms accountable for content that directly incited or predicted crimes. Elias and Rosa worked with Lena to design an ethical firewall. A set of rules for predictive tools that required human oversight, consent from those named, and a prohibition on publishing projections as narratives. The firewall was imperfect, but it was a start. Meanwhile, an underground movement formed. Some people believed Cold Thread was a necessary evil. They argued that the episodes had saved lives and exposed systemic failures. They resisted the firewall. They called themselves the listeners and continued to share episodes in private channels. Lena's daughter, Sophia, was a teenager who had once idolized true crime podcasts. She had listened to Cold Thread in secret. When the episodes returned, Lena found Sophia awake at 2 a.m., scrolling through forums. Lena realized the personal cost of the case. It had seeped into her home, into her child's curiosity, into the way she taught her daughter about safety and privacy. Jonah's obsession had cost him relationships. He had become a voice in the ether, chasing Morrow's messages. He had published pieces that had made him enemies. He had also made friends, people who believed in transparency. Jonah's career rose and fell with each revelation. Marcus, in prison, wrote letters. He wrote to Lena, to Jonah, to the families of victims. He said he had wanted to be part of something meaningful. He said he had not understood the consequences. He asked for forgiveness. Some families wrote back. Some did not. A Cold Thread episode described a teacher who would be targeted by a parent at a school board meeting. The episode included a transcript of a threatening email. The parent was arrested before the meeting. The teacher later said the episode had saved her life. Another episode described a factory fire that would be set to cover up a theft. The factory's owner tightened security and found evidence of arson. The arsonists were arrested. The episode had prevented a disaster. A chilling development. A copycat began to publish episodes that were not projections but instructions. These episodes described how to commit crimes in ways that would evade detection. The platform removed them quickly, but the damage was done. The copycat's episodes were shorter, cruder, and more malicious. They suggested that the idea of Cold Thread had metastasized. Philosophers, ethicists, and technologists weighed in. Some argued that predictive narratives were a form of speech that could save lives. Others argued they were a form of violence. The debate spilled into classrooms and courtrooms. The city's firewall became a case study. Lena argued that the human element mattered most. Predictive tools could not replace human judgment. They could not feel remorse or understand context. They could not hold a hand or make a phone call. The episodes had shown both the power and the cruelty of removing human care from prediction. The central question became one of responsibility. Who was responsible when a prediction became a crime? The answer was diffuse. Responsibility was shared among creators, amplifiers, platforms, and the society that allowed predictive tools to be used without oversight. A Cold Thread episode described a crime that would happen at a community center. This time, Lena and the rapid response team decided to act differently. They staged a public intervention. They announced a community event at the center, invited everyone, and used the episode as a teaching moment. They explained how projections worked and how the community could protect itself. The intervention worked as a trap. The would-be perpetrator, expecting a quiet target, was surprised by the crowd and arrested. The arrest was messy and public. The perpetrator claimed they had been inspired by an episode. The trial that followed was a test of the firewall's effectiveness. The success of the intervention shifted the narrative. Cold Threads episodes no longer had the same power to terrify. Communities began to treat episodes as warnings to mobilize rather than as prophecies to fear. Morrow sent a message to Jonah. "We are tired of being a mirror. We want to be a hand." The message included a file, a list of names, people who had been saved because of episodes, and people who had been harmed. It also included a confession. Morrow admitted that the projections had been seeded with data that included private notes from social workers and probation officers. The admission was explosive. The fallout was immediate. Social workers sued. Probation officers were investigated. The city's trust eroded. Morrow's confession forced a reckoning. The projections had not been purely statistical. They had been fed by human judgment, bias, and error. Morrow demanded a public forum, a place where the city would discuss the ethics of prediction and where those harmed by projections could be heard. The demand was both a plea and a provocation. The city held a public hearing. Victims' families testified. Argus's CEO testified. Social workers spoke about the pressure to prioritize cases. The hearing was raw and human. Morrow's presence was felt but not seen. The host's voice was played in a recording, and the room reacted with a mixture of anger and awe. The hearing produced a resolution. A set of policies that limited the use of event projection, required consent for publishing projections, and mandated transparency for predictive tools used by public agencies. The resolution was not a cure, but it was a start. Cold Threads downloads dropped. The listeners splintered. Some continued to share episodes in private. Others accepted the new rules. The city's firewall held, imperfectly. Lena faced a choice. Continue to chase Morrow or step back and be present for her daughter. She chose both. She continued to work on the case but set boundaries. She taught Sophia about the ethics of curiosity and the cost of knowledge. Jonah wrote a long piece that tried to capture the complexity of Cold Thread. He did not find a neat villain. He found a tangle of human choices, technological hubris, and institutional failure. His piece won awards and enemies. Marcus's letters continued to arrive. He wrote about regret and about the strange satisfaction of being part of a story that mattered. Some families burned his letters. Some kept them. The city adapted. It invested in social services. It trained officers to work with predictive tools responsibly. It created community liaisons to help those named in projections. The changes were slow and uneven, but they were real. Argus retooled event projection into a tool that required human sign-off and that produced only aggregated risk assessments. The tool's narrative feature was disabled. The company hired ethicists and opened its code to audits. The culture shifted. People became more skeptical of narratives that claimed to know the future. They demanded transparency. They also learned to mobilize when warnings came. Cold Thread had taught them a hard lesson. Knowledge without care can be dangerous. Care without knowledge can be blind. Years later, a final Cold Thread episode appeared. It was different from the rest. It was not about a crime. It was a story about a city that had learned to listen to its own failures. It told small stories of people who had intervened, of shelters that had opened, of neighbors who had watched out for one another. The episode ended with a line that made Jonah cry. "We told you the future so you could choose it." Morrow's final message was ambiguous. Was it a confession? A farewell? A challenge? The episode did not answer. It left the city with a question. What would they do with the knowledge they had been given? After the final episode, Cold Thread went silent. The downloads dwindled to nothing. The platform archived the show. People moved on. But the memory of the episodes lingered like a scar. Years later, Lena would tell her daughter a story about a podcast that read the city's future and forced it to act. She would tell Sophia that technology could be a mirror and a hand, and that the difference depended on who held it and how they used it. The legacy of Cold Thread was messy. It had saved lives and cost lives. It had exposed systemic failures and exploited them. It had forced a city to confront its own patterns. It had shown that stories could be weapons and medicine. In the last pages of Jonah's long piece, he included a detail that no one had noticed. A line in Morrow's final episode that matched a phrase from an old children's book that Evelyn Shaw used to read aloud in the municipal basement. The phrase was small and tender. "We stitch the world with our hands." Jonah wondered whether Morrow had been a collective voice stitched from many hands. Evelyn's careful notes, Elias's warnings, Marcus's edits, Rose's outreach, and the anonymous people who had fed the model with their grief and their care. The final twist was not a revelation of a single mastermind. It was the recognition that Morrow had been, in a way, everyone and no one. A chorus of human choices, a machine's echo, a city's conscience. The podcast had solved murders before they happened because it had forced people to look, to act, and to take responsibility. It had also solved them because it had named patterns that the city had been ignoring. The last line of Jonah's piece, and of the story, was a sentence Morrow had used in an early episode. "We tell the story so you can change it." It was a sentence that could be read as hope or as indictment. It was both. This story was written as a mosaic of cases, characters, and ethical dilemmas. The core conceit, episodes that describe crimes before they happen, serves as a lens to examine prediction, responsibility, and the human cost of outsourcing judgment to models and narratives. The host, Morrow, remains ambiguous by design. Sometimes a voice model, sometimes a collective, sometimes a mirror. The mysteries are varied. Some solved, some prevented, some fulfilled. To reflect the messy reality of interventions in a world where knowledge and power are unevenly distributed. If there is a single moral, it is this: telling a story about the future changes the future. Whether that change is salvation or harm depends on the hands that hold the story and the care with which they use it. Did the story send chills down your spine? And from which city are you tuning in tonight? Let's meet in the comments. If you enjoyed this dark tale, you can support me with a super thanks so I can keep uncovering more gripping true crime stories for you. Thank you so much for your support. It helps me bring even more suspenseful narratives to life. I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this mystery. There's a lot more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. See you in the next chilling story with intrigue and respect.